Ambassador Richmond, thank you so much for joining us. I am thrilled to have this conversation with you, and I can't think of a better person in the world to help us as we work through answering questions about COVID-19 and its impacts on human trafficking.
It's great to be with you, Kelsey. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Yes. So to get us started, can you please share more about your role as ambassadors as well as the strategies of the U.S. State Department's Trafficking in Persons Office?
Absolutely. In the year 2000, Congress created the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that established an office within the State Department solely dedicated to the issue of freedom. This idea that how do we make sure that we can take the laws that have been passed around the world and the laws that had recently been passed in the Palermo Protocol of 2000 and extend those to the people they were intended to protect. And so we serve as America's voice in this around the world as we try to encourage governments to foremost prosecute traffickers, protect victims, and prevent this crime from occurring by changing systems that make it easy for traffickers to operate. Our office has three main goals. One is our bilateral engagement with other countries around the world. So we engage this with our people, with our time, our resources. We have a great team of professionals at the State Department that span out around the globe, except of course during this quarantine, and meet with their counterparts in governments and try to encourage them to apply their laws faithfully to make sure that victims are protected. We also use multilateral organizations as part of that as we try to help governments along. The other thing we do is we coordinate the domestic response to trafficking. So unlike most offices within the State Department, we actually have a domestic mandate. We support the domestic coordination from the interagency, working with colleagues at the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, and ultimately 22 federal departments as they work to apply the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And the third thing we do is engage with folks like you and your audience as we try to think through ways that we can engage in thought leadership, as we can drive the conversation forward to identify current trends and think about how we can respond.
That is a fantastic role, John. Fantastic work that you are doing. One of the things that we've spent a lot of time talking about is the prosecution of traffickers, and that being part of your strategy. Not only are we seeing many not only are we not seeing very many trafficking prosecutions in the US and abroad, we're also seeing prosecutions declining. Could you maybe shed some light on why this is and what it will take for us as a movement to get more trafficking prosecutions?
This is a huge concern. When we look at the global numbers, we see over the last 4 years a 42% decline in global trafficking prosecutions. And that just means that this whole crime of human trafficking is a very high reward, low risk crime for traffickers. They enjoy impunity. And what we need to do is create specialized units. We need to make sure both for labor and sex trafficking, specialized courts, places where we can dedicate resources to make sure that these cases can be done. Now, I'm sensitive to the fact that people complain about problems in the criminal justice system. And let's just say for a moment that all those complaints are well-founded. There's lots of ways that we need to improve. But what we need to make sure is that we're not just raising concerns about the failures of the criminal justice system and then leaving them bare to lie fallow and traffickers to go and operate with impunity. We need to make sure we rise to meet those challenges, that we do that through investing in our criminal justice system, making sure that law enforcement, police, prosecutors have the tools they need to actually do their jobs, that we prioritize the rule of law and not allow traffickers just to roam free. Now, I'm also sensitive to the folks who say that we're never going to prosecute our way out of this. Well, that is, of course, true, but we're also never going to shelter our way out of it or have an awareness campaign to stop it. There are no silver bullets. But what we do know is that prosecution is a necessary and essential component of the ultimate solution. And we want to make sure that we prioritize that and we drive it forward.
So one thing that I've been reading about that maybe you could also shed light on is that COVID-19 may be impacting prosecutions. Could you share more about what you're expecting with this?
Yeah, there are a number of concerns as we think about the global response, not just to how we combat this virus, but also the impact of the global shutdown. We know that courts are meeting with less frequency, that police officers' ability to conduct proactive investigations might be degraded. We know that cases are not moving as quickly, and we know that in some cases, criminal justice systems, in order to reduce the spread of COVID in the population that's incarcerated, are releasing many individuals, some of whom may be traffickers. And we've heard anecdotal reports that survivors are deeply concerned about the idea that perhaps their trafficker may be back on the street and can harm them. We know that we have to make sure that in the midst of this time where people's attentions might be understandably focused on other issues, that we continually draw them back to prioritize freedom, to prioritize trafficking as a subject matter they have to engage in, because we have to have that criminal justice response to be successful.
So one of the main reasons we're gathered here today is to talk about more broadly how coronavirus, how COVID-19 is impacting human trafficking. We know that it's created so much uncertainty in our personal lives, in so many sectors of our society. And as Willow, like many nonprofit organizations, we've been pivoting our strategies to not only think about the immediate needs of survivors, but the future needs of survivors, the future needs of this movement. Could you share with us the various ways that you're seeing COVID-19 impacting human trafficking globally?
I can. I mean, I think it's impacting different groups in different ways. So for current victims, I think that they're less likely to find relief. They're less likely to have people of goodwill separate them from their traffickers. They're less likely to find rescue. For survivors, the amount and type of services might be degraded as well. We're seeing shelters that, in order to socially distance, have to spread people out and perhaps house fewer individuals that need care. We're seeing the fact that there's shelter-in-place rules actually being a trigger for trauma for other survivors. And we're seeing a great obstacle to survivors finding services and being able to access them, whether they can't use public transportation to get across town in order to get a service, or whether or not staff members at a specific NGO are still working at the same level in order to provide that service. So we're seeing it impact victims and survivors, but we're also seeing it impact NGOs and law enforcement. We talked a little about law enforcement, but we also see NGOs who are trying to keep their staff safe, keep their team members safe. And so they may not be working as much, or some might have actually fallen ill. And so the ability to give services or the quantity of services may have diminished. And then, of course, we're seeing how it impacts traffickers. And we're seeing traffickers innovate quickly and respond quickly to take advantage of this situation and continue their crimes.
Could you share a little bit more? That's really interesting. How the strategies of traffickers are changing in light of COVID-19.
Well, there's definitely been disruption to the traffickers' business model as well during this time. And they're responding differently depending on the sector and the industry that they're in. But we've seen some initial shifts. So for instance, sex traffickers that relied on customers being physically present, whether it might be in a brothel or at a track, or people meeting up in hotels, they're shifting to cyber sex trafficking, where they're forcing their victims to engage in commercial sex acts that are broadcast over web or on social media apps in order to make that exchange, where they can still make money. They're shifting to an electronic format. For labor traffickers, it's also very similar. We're seeing labor traffickers shift to a gig economy wherever they can, so they can keep their victims at work, keep monetizing them, keep trying to make money off of them by exploiting them and reducing them to just a commodity, when in reality, they're an incredibly valuable individual that has inherent value and human dignity. So traffickers at each turn are going to pivot. They're going to innovate. And they're not desperate for a grant cycle. They're not worried about another series of regulations. They don't have to get their new strategic plan approved by a board of directors. They can just lurch. They can lurch towards injustice and exploit other people.
Yeah, so that makes me wonder, are our strategies to combat trafficking going to have to change in response to COVID-19? Do you think that this is something that's temporary, or is it long-term?
Well, it's hard to know what all the strategies will do, but I would say that our strategy should always be adjusting to address how traffickers shift their operations. We've seen how traffickers have shifted historically from using cages and chains and bars to now using nonviolent coercion. So we had to adjust our strategies to deal with that. We've seen how they use threats to third parties like children sisters, cousins as a way to control people. And we had to change our strategies to deal with that. We saw how they shifted to online marketplaces like Backpage, and we had to shift our strategies to address that. And now with Backpage gone, we know that they shifted again, and we have to again adapt to what our human adversary is doing. And so that's going to continue as a process over and over again. We're always going to be in a battle against traffickers, trying to make sure that we can foil their illicit plans. And so we need to be wise about short-term changes, but also about long-term changes and how we can make sure we have the legal tools that are necessary, about how we can have the right people in place, both in service providing areas, in prevention areas, as well as prosecution areas, so that we can actually make a difference. And I think we really can.
Do you have any advice? I know we have a lot of nonprofits and foundations joining us here today. Do you have advice for how we can collaborate together right now during this time?
Well, I think what you're convening right now is part of it. There have been many other convenings. I know that groups of NGOs and leaders have gotten together on many occasions, sometimes over Zoom, sometimes over the phone, to talk about what they're seeing. I think it's incredibly important that we increase our communication at this point, that we're sharing information broadly about how this is affecting victims, how we know the vulnerable in the world are becoming more vulnerable, and traffickers are able to exploit them with much greater ease, using less coercive resources. And so we want to make sure we're hearing about how those changes are happening and that we can shift to address them. And so I think it's important for NGOs to collaborate together in order to accomplish that goal of clarifying what the information is so that we can move forward. Now, as we do that, we also have to work with governments, because we know that governments have the primary responsibility of enforcing their laws, not just their prosecution laws, but also their protection laws, and making sure that individuals that are being harmed get the care they need. And so I think that civil society plays an amazingly important role in communicating to government how it needs to respond. And government leaders hear that. When civil society comes and says, keep this a priority, the government leaders will hear that. And we need to make sure that we continue to put forward the cause of freedom in the midst of the pandemic.
Another question that a lot of people have been asking is, how are closing borders? How is that affecting human trafficking?
You know, I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of this, because we have now seen borders close almost all over the world. We see migration just absolutely snarl. For years, we have struggled with the conflation between human smuggling and human trafficking. That is, smuggling being a crime that is about movement, about moving people across a border. It violates the integrity of a border, and it's a crime against a country's laws. But it can be done voluntary or involuntary by the person being smuggled. Trafficking, on the other hand, has always been involuntary. It always involves the violation of someone's fundamental human rights. And so there's always been this struggle. When people hear about trafficking, they think about movement. In fact, there have been many places where folks have misapplied and imputed a requirement that movement occur in order for trafficking to happen. With the fact that borders have been closed and we're seeing trafficking still continue, it magnifies this point that trafficking has nothing to do with the movement of people. It just has to deal with the coercion of individuals. One specific way that COVID is dealing with this, as we respond to COVID, we create these shelter-in-place rules. And those shelter-in-place rules, sometimes these mandates mock the reality that many victims are being told to shelter in place with their traffickers. They're being quarantined with the very people that are exploiting them in commerce. And it's even more harmful when the person you're told to quarantine with is actually a family member who is trafficking you. And we know that there is a significant number of folks for whom home is not safe. And so I think we're seeing an unintended adverse consequence in that regard. And we need to be aware of that. We need to think through how we make sure that victims right now who are being told to stay at home are actually getting the care they need.
That is a fantastic point, and it brings me to the next thing I wanted to discuss with you. At Willow in East Africa, we have been seeing very similar trends. Many of the graduates who have gone through our aftercare programs, as well as survivors in community-based care, have been reporting extreme difficulties with the shelter-in-place rules. Many of them have not been able to get to the hospital to get treatment for things like HIV. medical care for their children or even treatment for COVID-19. And during the lockdown, they've reported that the shelter in place has been very re-traumatizing and triggering of their trauma of being locked in a small space, some of them with unhealthy people, some of them with people who have trafficked them. Could you share some of the other ways that you're hearing survivors are being impacted by COVID-19, and maybe how you think they will continue to be impacted as the shelter-in-place orders are lifted?
It's going to be interesting as we watch these shelter-in-place orders be modified. I imagine they'll be slowly modified over time. It won't be a flipping of the switch. It won't be an instantaneous change. But slowly, there's going to be more freedom, more access for individuals. And as that happens, I'm hoping that we're going to have people of goodwill rushing in. We're going to have individuals who are trained, who are thoughtful, who are working with established NGOs around the world, coming in to support them as they try to provide this care. Because you're correct, that the shelter-in-place orders could be triggering pre-existing trauma. They could be creating new trauma. We know that individuals haven't been getting the medical care they need, including perhaps for COVID. We know that individuals haven't been able to access services, be educated, or have just access to whatever was stabilizing them. The relationships in the community that helped them deal with things, they may be estranged from during this time. And so as the restrictions are lifted, we're just going to have to move in. We're going to have to move in closer with more and more care, trying to make sure that it's individualized for each individual victim. I think one thing we need to make sure in this time is that we don't have one-size-fits-all answers for victim protection services, that every victim is seen as an individual. You know, for some, sheltering in place may actually be a very safe thing. It may be the best thing that's happened to them. It's actually alienated their trafficker from them in a new way. While, as we mentioned, for others, it may actually keep them close to them. So every individual is going to have a different situation. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's going to require a lot of time, a lot of attention, and a lot of people who are willing to invest in them.
I love what you've brought up, and I think it's a really important point for all of us to hear, is that we can't think about the next survivors that are going to come into aftercare programs. We have to be thinking about those who have been through aftercare programs, those who have been resettled, they're back in community, they're back living independently. They're going to need support too, because this has impacted their lives. And so the burden is going to be on the nonprofit sector, on government services who provide victim services, to ensure that we don't forget survivors who have already received services, that they're getting access to care too. It's a fabulous.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I was also just add that to encourage companies and businesses as they restart to hire back survivors that may have lost their jobs. We know that many survivors have lost the economic engine that powers them, their job in the private industry that allows them to alienate themselves from their trafficker, to make sure to keep the trafficker at bay because they're not in financial dire straits. So we want to make sure they get their jobs back. We want to make sure that they're able to create jobs in this new economy. We know that employment is such an incredibly powerful tool, particularly when it's not just a charity job, but it's a job that allows a career, a path for that survivor to feel that they can be self-sufficient and contribute to the economy.
Yeah, I actually, a call just came out recently for funding for organizations working with vulnerable populations. And one of the great things that they included was funding for organizations to help vulnerable women, especially those impacted by gender-based violence, to open up their businesses again. Because for however long they sheltered in place, they couldn't pay their rent. And I think that's a fantastic strategy. I'm hoping that we see more of the funding community responding that way.
Absolutely.
Another thing that you had mentioned earlier was labor trafficking. And this is something that I would love to talk to you more about. We know that the majority of trafficking victims in the world are victims of labor trafficking. And I've been hearing a lot about how COVID-19 is impacting our supply chains. Things are changing. We have migrant workers stuck in certain countries who are used to being a part of these supply chains. It seems very complex and very difficult to grasp what is happening. But could you maybe shed some light on how the pandemic is impacting labor trafficking, or maybe what the results of the pandemic are going to be potentially on labor trafficking and labor exploitation?
Yeah, it's such an important question because you're absolutely right. There are many individuals who are being forced to work And now those facilities where they're working are shutting down. And so they could be easily discarded. Discarded in a country that is not their own, in a country where perhaps they have locked down the borders or their visa doesn't allow them to move back and forth freely. And so now they're without a job, they're not earning a wage, and they're even more vulnerable to other types of crime. And so we want to make sure that in the midst of this, that we're able to use this break as an opportunity to conduct a bunch of new investigations, to go in and find out. Perhaps now there might be some additional access to labor trafficking victims that we didn't have before. And so we want to go in and interview them, find out from them if there are indicators of trafficking that might suggest that their company was harming them, so that before the company could start back up, we can make sure that we could intervene and make sure that they're not forced to work there again. We also know that it's not just companies that are forcing people to work in some areas, but it's governments themselves. And I think we have to express real concern where the government is the trafficker. And so where we see state-sanctioned forced labor around the world, whether it's in commerce and industry or whether it's as child soldiers, we want to make sure that we can also address their concerns. We know that this crisis has made vulnerable people more vulnerable. The UN has estimated that 500 million people are going to be pushed into poverty because of this shutdown. And that's going to mean that traffickers have a larger pool of individuals to pick from when they're looking for vulnerable people to exploit. That's going to be true with migrants that are shifting their location for work. That's going to be true with individuals that they're looking to traffic for commercial sex. And so as traffickers are going to have an easier time recruiting, we have to double our efforts. We have to make sure that the global community is prioritizing this issue, that NGOs are raising this up, that people of goodwill are making sure that they are rallying around organizations, whether they're local, national, or international, that are actually in this fight. This is a time to lean in.
Wonderful. So we have a lot of questions coming in for you, John. I want to make sure that we do not miss time to get to these questions. So I'm going to start with the first one for you from Ravi. He says, the UNODC has recently come out with a brief on COVID-19 and human trafficking. The Office to Monitor Trafficking in Persons has also tweeted about this report. The US TIP law requires JTIP to monitor and combat human trafficking across the world. What leadership is JTIP going to ensure that an international response against human trafficking is taken to ensure that vulnerable people don't end up being trafficked?
No, let me just thank Ravi for the question, and in particular for the partnership that we have had with the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, UNODC. I have worked with them for over a decade, just had a call with them recently with their leadership. Thankful for their commitment and work during this time, and the report they put out is another new resource, particularly as we're dealing with this pandemic. You know, right now, we don't have a ton of data. We have a lot of knowledgeable people that are providing their sense of things, their anecdotes about what they're seeing, but data is going to become trickling in over the next few months. And as it does, hopefully that data can help inform decision-making that is driven around the specific conditions on the ground. UNODC is poised to be a huge leader in that. And the Trafficking in Persons Office of the State wants to join them in that regard as we lean into this issue. How do we ensure that vulnerable people are not exploited? We do all the things that we've been talking about on this call. We continue to call governments to focus on the 3 Ps of prosecution, protection, and prevention. We want it done in a victim-centered way. We want to make sure everyone gets individualized, trauma-informed services. But there is no silver bullet. And the environment in which we're operating in just became tremendously more difficult. So this isn't an opportunity where we get to say that we have a quick fix. Instead, it's that we have a lasting commitment. And UNODC has been a great partner in that, and we're looking forward to working with them over the coming months.
I love that. And John, you bring up such an important point, which is how vital collaboration is in this space. That victim services organizations have to partner with organizations like the Trafficking Institute, who work to empower police and prosecutors. We all have to be working together for a cohesive and comprehensive response. A good friend of ours, Ambassador Richmond, Judge Maria Hernandez has asked your thoughts on how the courts can best respond to assist.
Well, it's great to get a question from Judge Hernandez. I feel like I should sit up straight and say, Your Honor. I'm a fan of Judge Hernandez's work, and she's done such incredible work in California. You know, I think that for Judge Hernandez, probably very little needs to change, but for many other judges on the bench, I think there is a great deal that needs to change. And that is, I think we need more specialized courts. I think we need more judges who have been specifically trained in the issues that recur in these cases. You know, trafficking cases have for years, people have complained that they're just full of challenges, and so they kind of leave them undone. And instead of that, I think we need to rise to those challenges and overcome them. And so judges like Judge Hernandez hopefully can train other judges that we can anticipate evolving statements from survivors when they're testifying in court, that we have strategies to limit the cross-examination of those survivors, that we have ways to stabilize them during the court proceedings, that in countries where we don't have trials being conducted on consecutive days, that we shift to that model where trials are not stretched out one trial day a month over multiple months with lots of continuances, that we limit the number of adjournments, that we make sure that that defendants have to stand in the dock and they can exercise their right to defend themselves, but they have to do so in the specific setting of that court, and they can't stretch it out as a way to terrorize their victims even more. There are ways we can use pseudonyms for victims to protect their identity, to make sure that they're not shamed publicly or in the media. There's all sorts of thoughtful ways that victims can experience the judicial system in a more kinder, gentler, victim-centered way that doesn't infringe with the defendant's right to due process and to make sure they get a fair trial. But we need more courts. We need more judges who actually understand these issues, who understand trauma, who can take the extra time that is necessary in order to hear these cases in a thoughtful way. So the way we do that is we pour resources into this area. It's not enough just to tell a bench of very busy judges to do a better job when they have just piles and piles of cases waiting to be called in front of them. We have to give them the space and time in order to do these cases. And that means more judges in more courtrooms with smaller dockets, with better staff, in order to make sure that we can handle these cases.
Thank you, Ambassador Richmond. We have another question from Elisa, which is, why is human trafficking not talked about in public school systems, being that children and young adults are the most vulnerable population in the face of trafficking?
It's a fascinating question, and of course, school systems vary. I know I've got 2 kids in high school right now, and they've been hearing about trafficking in their high school. I know there have been some states that have now issued a K through 12 or an 8 through 12, I believe, a prevention education program, a curriculum within their schools. So it may vary state by state or county by county, but I do think there's some folks out there who are putting curriculum about prevention education into schools. Could it be more? Could it be better? Absolutely. And hopefully folks will keep innovating and creating better education programs. But as they do, it'd be my hope that we don't just try to use prevention education as a way to warn vulnerable young people about menacing traffickers that might be lurking in corners trying to harm them. I don't want to make them afraid. I want to make them inspired. I want them to feel like they can actually make a difference. And so these education programs ought to call people to a larger idea of justice, that we can make wrong things right in big ways, in small ways, in local ways, in global ways, that we can actually call upon these young people to take up careers in accounting and become a forensic accountant and try to catch some of these trends. They could become social workers, counselors, and prosecutors and FBI agents. They could actually join the fight and rise up as the next generation of leaders. They're going to make sure that we deliver on this promise of freedom. I think we can have a prevention education program, and we can have curriculums in school that do more than just kind of warn people about generic indicators, but help them understand the heart of this crime and how traffickers are operating and how we can work to change systems to make it more difficult for them to prey on the vulnerable.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Brenda Wells. I know Brenda, she's here in California. She asks, regarding prosecution, in California, we're experiencing a zero bail process, and those arrested are being released immediately. Is there any possible response to this?
You know, every state is different from its criminal law, but I can tell you that I believe there's a huge benefit to pretrial detention in sex trafficking and forced labor cases. And I say that as someone who's probably not a fan of pretrial detention in most other situations. But where you have vulnerable victims, making sure that a trafficker is detained upon arrest begins to deconstruct the lies that they have told their victims. Traffickers often tell their victims that they have the judicial system in their back pocket and they can get out whenever they want and nothing will happen to them. And so when they get arrested and then immediately released, it just reinforces that narrative to the victims that their traffickers are never going to face accountability. Having their traffickers detained pre-trial allows that narrative to be broken. It also allows some separation from the trafficker so that the victims might actually be able to be stabilized and find some services. If federally in the United States, pretrial detention is mandatory for all traffickers who are charged under the federal system. There's a presumption in favor of detention. That's not true in every state. And obviously we want to make sure that people are not incarcerated unlawfully or for too long a period of time pending trial. But one nice benefit of holding them pre-trial is that to exercise their speedy trial rights, they want that trial to come sooner rather than later, which shortens the time that a victim might have to experience the criminal justice system.
Thank you. We have a question next from Mark Magdick. He is a consultant on organized crime and human trafficking. And he's asking how you think COVID-19 is going to impact the market of supply and demand of victims. He's asking if the price to buy or access a victim will be increased or decline in light of COVID-19.
That'll be interesting to see. And I look forward to hearing from Mark or from others here as they're trying to evaluate within each community, within each sort of micro economy, how that is going. But I can see for a time that as demand may be temporarily reduced, as many, potentially in a sex trafficking context, as many sex buyers are sheltering in place with their families at home, that they're less available to go out and to engage in that illicit industry. And if that is the case, that would suggest that the cost of purchasing commercial sex would decrease. I can also see an instance where if an innovative trafficker is providing a unique service that mitigates some of the challenges a traditional sex buyer might face, the price might actually increase. I think it's going to vary, and I think it's going to be dynamic, particularly during this period of transition. So I think in many ways, we just don't know the answer yet.
I'm going to do one more question before we wrap it up with our final question. This comes from Polly Williams at Orangewood Children's Foundation. She runs a fantastic aftercare program and drop-in center. Thank you for joining us, Polly. How do we advocate for more funding to evaluate our programs, to enhance the development of more robust evidence-based programming, to ensure our approaches are consistent with being trauma-informed and survivor-centered? What a great question.
Fantastic question. I think this is a huge area of growth for the anti-trafficking field. For far too long, our advocacy has been anchored in emotional anecdotes, and we're passionate about them, and we've experienced them, and we know they're true, but we know that actual evaluation, metrics, data, and scholarship are going to drive big moves in public policy and therefore public funding. And so the more that we can build into our programs, build into our interventions, a way to actually measure not just activities, but results, not just what we're doing, but the impact of what we're doing is having. What I mean by that is it's not just the number of hours of a training or the number of people that attended the training, but what happened as a result of that training. It's not just the number of shelter beds, but how do we measure the quality of care that people actually received? And how do we do that in a way that honors survivors as they experience that? That we're not now reducing them to a unit of measure, that we're actually still seeing them as individuals, but we need to make sure these programs have some level of rigor to them. And this is an area of huge growth. At the State Department, we're making a big investment in measurement, making a big investment in impact in all of our programming, but specifically around our requirement to measure reductions in prevalence. And so we'll be seeing at the end of May, we're rolling out a new prevalence reduction innovation forum. We're going to be funding a number of different prevalence studies around the world, but not nationwide prevalence studies. We're going to be rolling out some prevalence studies that are industry specific and geographically restricted, because the type of survey instrument that you would use to measure the prevalence of one industry often doesn't fit to measure the prevalence in another. For instance, if you're going to measure the number of adults that are forced to work in the agricultural field, you would ask very different questions of a very different audience than if you were asking how many boys are trafficked for commercial sex in a metro area. And so we've decided to ask these questions and to try different methodologies, and then to compare those methodologies in a meta-analysis to determine if we can develop a toolbox for how we're going to go forward with prevalence measurement in the future. And do all of this with a common statistical definition that's anchored around the Palermo Protocol, this sort of act, means, and purpose. So that's just one example of how we're trying to push into measurement. But there's probably others. And hopefully for Polly, she can come up with ways to measure what they're doing. And all of us in the field, I think this is an area of growth.
I am so excited about your prevalence studies. That sounds fantastic, and it's so needed. I know all of us are trying to wrap our heads and have been trying to wrap our heads around prevalence. So thank you for that initiative. That is incredible. Ambassador Richmond, as you know, we are an organization that really tries to spread a message of hope. Human trafficking can be a dark and overwhelming issue to address, but there is so much hope that we see. I know you and I have had conversations about how much hope there is. And so we are in this series going to ask all of our speakers if they could answer, what gives you hope right now?
You know, Kelsey, it's such an important question. If I were to sum it up in one word, it would be doability. What gives me hope is the fact that the cause we have is doable. We can actually make a difference. And I think there are three reasons why. The first is that we know what to do. We know how to identify victims. We know how to stop traffickers. We know how to provide basic comprehensive care. And two, we know that there are people of goodwill in governments all over the world who want to use their laws to protect people. We just have to come alongside them, to guide them, to resource them, to provide them best practices, to encourage them, to give them the political will, and to motivate them to get this done. So not only do we know what to do, and we have people of goodwill in governments all over the world, but I think we have history on our side. So the third reason for hope is that history works in our favor. For more than 4,000 years of recorded human history, some form of slavery, some form of human trafficking has been legal. It's been culturally accepted, it's been religiously endorsed, it's been democratically approved. And all that changed about 220 years ago, when we began to see one nation after another pass laws against the slave trade, and then ultimately against trafficking. And so when you think about this long timeline of history of 4,000 years of recorded human history, and then in just the last sliver of time, this last 200 years, we've seen a massive transformation in the legal landscape. And now every country in the world has some sort of law against trafficking. That's amazing. That did not exist 220 years ago, but today it does. And most of those laws have come in the last 20 years since the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the adoption of the UN's Palermo Protocol. And so now we just have to keep folks focused on this priority of freedom. We have to take the parchment protections of law and extend them down to the people they were intended to protect. This is just a fantastic time to be in this movement. It's a fantastic time to be engaged in this work because we have the ability now, we have the tools at hand, we have the information we need to really dig in and make a difference. And together we can do that. So traffickers may not be shutting down, but we're not going to shut down either. And we're going to stay in this fight.
Wow. Well, I am inspired. That was very hopeful, very uplifting. I think on behalf of everyone on the call, we want to thank you for your time, for that inspiring message that gives us hope to keep on fighting, that we're in this movement at an incredible time where we can have a huge impact. We cannot thank you enough for taking the time to be here with us today, for shedding light on this important topic during this very uncertain time. You are an incredible gift to all of us in this movement, and thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey. Grateful for you and your work. Thank you for all the participants on this call. I know there have been survivors, there have been foundation heads, there have been government leaders. There's so many interesting people who are here, many of whom have their own ideas, and I would have loved to hear from them. And so I just invite you to stay engaged, to stay involved, to connect with the Trafficking in Persons Office. We want to be open and available. We want to be a resource to you, but we also want to learn from you. We want to hear what you're seeing on the ground so that we can better do our jobs.
Thank you. And again, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Ambassador Richmond. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon and a great week.
Thank you.
Take care.